Hi everybody, welcome to part 3 of this two-part video series where we've focused on enterprise bargaining and unions and getting the desired results can be a challenge. So we've discussed in the first two parts of this video an aged and community care organisation who, as a result of changes within the industry and probably as a result of government and political changes, has meant that they've needed to be more competitive or certainly flag what its future direction is, and as a result we've had pending enterprise agreements that have been current but expired for some time, with the view that based on those changes in the industry and the flexibilities required to remain sustainable over the long term, there's a need to move agreement making forward. The last video I flagged and posed some questions to you around what you might do if you were faced as a practitioner in a similar situation. Would you agree with some of those management conversations around moving to enterprise agreement negotiations, noting the environment in which the business is operating in, and two, I think around the flexibilities that they need to achieve, is enterprise bargaining agreement effectively the option or the way for them to go? So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and hopefully as we have those discussions in class that you'll get to share what that is, and we can certainly have some robust conversations around it. But probably just to let you know, certainly in this particular part, I'm going to take you through the proposal or the decisions that were made as a result of the initial ER strategy conversation, and then how did we commence that negotiation process with representatives and what that involved, and some of the challenges that we've faced to date. So I can confirm that there was a decision was made to proceed with one agreement for our home care business, our residential business, and also our Hello House staff, with a view that our administration team employees would sit within each of those agreements depending on the workplace in which they resided. The decision was made to move away from an agreement that was position title, position stream based to entities, which does make sense. Our home care business is very different to our residential business. The only challenge will come though is if we have care workers wanting to and or working across our residential and home care business, in the sense that it's unlikely for them to have two sets of terms. Which one's more favourable? Do we opt with that? How do we engage them if we were to look at doing them, having a dual role across both locations? So there's a challenge in all of that, but it's important, I think, for the business to consider how those businesses operate and run, and the funding that sits behind them. It means too that when we look to negotiate and start to make some decisions around what we call the boot test or the better off overall test, is that there's a number of modern awards that we need to consider. So when it comes to drafting one agreement for each of these areas, we have to combine effectively the terms and conditions from 4 agreements to 1 in order for it to pass, but to make sure too that we get some consistency in terms and conditions of employment. There's certainly a clear need and focus for the organisation to control its costs now and into the future, and I think the biggest challenge for this particular organisation is the 3-hour minimum engagement, with the need for our clients and their service varying from anything from 15 minutes to 3 hours. So I think this was a key driver in wanting to proceed with an agreement, specifically in home care, because that same issue doesn't appear in our residential business, and keeping them separate makes some sense. I think it's important though to consider some other things that may be of importance, which is negotiating one agreement for 250 employees out of the 900, for example, now, meaning that we deal with the home care employees and not residential. And there could be the question about whether the others, pending the negotiation of their agreement, will they get a wage review, for example. So these agreements expired in 2014. Their last increase was in March last year. I'm sure it'll be clear from the unions that they would want to seek some sort of interim administrative increase for their members in our residential business, because we're not starting their negotiation until post the home care. So that may be a question we need to be aware of, and probably an answer that we need to have to resolve that. The other might be to issue of scope. So members will be split across agreements, which means that unions may or may not be comfortable with having their members across different agreements. There could be the possible argument of discrimination on the basis that their members are going to be covered by different industrial instruments, and that we may be trying to strip conditions and terms from one group, being home care, to residential. So we've probably got to be very careful about the message we send when we have a negotiation around why we're doing this, what's the purpose of it, and the key for us is flexibility and efficiency. But how do we then sell that to say that we're hoping to achieve some sort of relative consistency in terms and conditions without really promising that, knowing that we haven't negotiated a residential agreement. By always remaining true then to what our organisational purpose is about introducing these agreements. We want to achieve that flexibility, and we acknowledge that home care and residential are separate businesses and that they are vastly different. In all of that, we could have our own arguments around coverage, but unions could, throughout the course of negotiation, argue that point. And one option for them is, if they are not comfortable with that coverage piece, that they would have every right to go to Fair Work and lodge a scope order. And what we mean by a scope order is that if they believe that their members will be disadvantaged as a result of an enterprise bargaining agreement process, that they could lodge a scope order with the Commission to seek to have that ramified, rectified as well. So there's a bit of a snapshot around the proposal in principle. The next step of the process from an EBA point of view, or Enterprise Bargaining Agreement point of view, is the negotiation process and starting to inform our workforce that we are now in that space to want to negotiate. So how did we negotiate? So how did this aged and community care provider negotiate, and what process did we follow? What was our plan? So one, it was about understanding and documenting who would be covered by this agreement. So noting that we've got employees across care, support services, nursing and allied health. How many of those particular groups do we want covered in this one agreement for home care? And if there are separate groups, then we need to make sure we exclude them from the agreement and be very clear about that. That then forms the basis of what we call a notice of representational rights, and we have an obligation under the Act, so the Fair Work Act, to notify all of those to be covered by a enterprise agreement to indicate that the organisation's ready to bargain. They can then appoint themselves as representatives to sit on the bargaining committee or negotiation committee table, and our obligation to advise unions that would have representation in terms of coverage of members in our industry. So for example, you're a nurse, you would have access or right to be a member of Queensland Nurses Union, and there's a number of other unions, Together Union, United Voice, that represent the support services piece of our business, like care workers, bus drivers, cleaners, those things. So it's important, when we started the process, was that we had a meeting scheduled where we held and just discussed strategy and we discussed coverage. We didn't put the agreement forward, and we wanted to have an open conversation about the fact that we wanted to bargain and we wanted to commence that process, and then flag our reasons and rationale around scope. There were considerable and significant concerns raised by unions around coverage. One, as I had alluded to a little earlier, membership, agreement timing, and lodgement. This is probably the biggest issue that we've faced as a result of this bargaining process. So we've had 5 meetings in total. The challenge is, out of the four of those 5 meetings, scope has continued to come to the fore around membership and the view that they wanted to move to one agreement. So where we had 4 agreements, being allied health, support services, nursing and administration, why was it the organisation's intention to move to 3 agreements for those particular entities rather than just one for all of the organisation, with the view that you would have then streams within there around classifications? That wasn't the organisation's position, and we continued to argue that, and we have continued to maintain that position. The challenge by moving that would be that that would open up a scope order and would challenge, our position in Fair Work. So we had these meetings and continued to have those meetings with the view that we'd agreed that we would put together an agreement. So rather than do that collaboratively together, look at all the agreements, what's in, what's out, we had our own internal workshop where we brought our leaders and stakeholders together, and we identified from those agreements what works well, what doesn't, what things need to be in, what things need to be out, and things that we might need to compromise on or adjust. So we came together with one agreement, combined 4 lots of terms to one, and in doing so we identified that there were things that we took off employees, things that we added, and a few things that remained neutral. So in all of that, we decided to put together a comparison document to assist with that process. Initially, when the unions had received a copy of the agreement, we hadn't thought about the comparison document. In retrospect, we believe it was a good document to give because we didn't consult with the unions and our representatives in the developing and drafting of the agreement. They were concerned that we'd added clauses from previous agreements or added items that might have benefited the organisation, and that there might have been some underhanded tactics about why we did that without actually their involvement. So to try and alleviate that, we put a comparison document together on each clause about, green being more positive, red being less than, previously entitled, and then sort of orange being neutral terms that haven't really changed overall. Some of the issues that we faced then as a result of that, because we developed the agreement to the exclusion, certainly representatives, we wanted to push this agreement forward. The view was to have 4 or 5 meetings and a view that we would lodge the agreement within 3 months of effectively drafting. I've been in negotiations before where agreements have taken months and months, if not years. The organisation had some very strict timeframes to meet the funding changes within community. And as a result of that, we had issues of secrecy, level of openness and transparency. So that's really hindered the process to date. Then slow and steady over the weeks and months, we've negotiated on key terms and items as I previously in part 2 identified with you around minimum shift engagements. We wanted to look at moving travel allowance being 78 cents back to the ATO rate, span of hours, wages being 2%. So most of the conditions seem to be a little inferior to what they'd experienced in previous agreements, but it was the reality check of where the world was today. And unfortunately, as a result of that, unions and representatives haven't come to the table or party with their claims because of those concerns of secrecy, openness and transparency. So for us, it's all about trying to be able to compromise. The challenge is about the timeliness of getting the agreement over the line versus rushing the agreement. In trying to compromise at this stage, we are still pushing forward. We've had meeting number 5. The view is to have another few meetings to determine where we're going. So the negotiation is still open, it's still live. There's still resilience, but it's important now for the organisation to get out there and talk to its employees about the draft and understand from them, because we haven't had a lot of feedback from representatives on what they would like to see, and to get a flavour about how soon we could go to vote and if they would accept the terms within the agreement. So as a result, those matters like span of hours, in addition to that, the travel allowance piece, we've actually conceded on those, and the key issue now for this organisation is just minimum shift engagement. As I said, that was previously 3 hours and it's now down to 90 minutes. So the challenge for us is we want to fight for the term that we needed, which is flexibility around how we engage our people to be able to meet our client needs. And we sent a very clear message to representatives that we've actually defeated and we've conceded on those peripheral clauses which originally were important for this business. So I think I'll leave it there in terms of this part. What I'll do next is, and for the last part, is to talk you through the realisation. So were those issues big issues for us, and why did we actually present them once we got the data in front of us? Some of the tips that I've picked up as part of the negotiation process that might be useful for you moving forward if you participate in negotiations yourself, where we are in terms of the outcome, and then some key learnings to take away around managing that employment relationship and the balance between the challenges of working in an industry of uncertainty and instability to making sure that we listen to our employees and our representatives to get the best outcomes. More soon.